Good afternoon, Quasar Markets Live. I've got a really good one today. Nathan Dean. I know a lot of people have been asking me a lot of policy questions, especially all the things that are going on. And from Nathan Dean from Bloomberg, you are the head of it, man. So let's talk about it, man. How are you today?
Good, good. We're actually thawing out for the first time in forever here in DC. It's going to be like 47 today. So I grew up in Chicago, but man, I have to give up. I gave up my Chicago card a long time ago. It's just too cold out.
I love it. Now, does that make you a Cubs fan or are you a White Sox fan?
I am a White Sox fan, married to a Cubs fan. But the reason why I'm a White Sox fan is because I grew up outside of the city, and I asked my dad, "Why did you always take me to Comiskey growing up?" And my dad said, "Because they have easy parking. I'm not driving to Wrigley." So
They have that. Really does have the worst parking. Of course, I'm from Southern Illinois. I'm a Cardinal fan, so I love this. And of course, Nathan, you living in DC. I did 16 years in DC, so I love this. All right, let's talk about it. A lot of policy coming out of the White House right now. Anything interesting piquing your engagement right now?
yeah, so obviously, I think the most important thing, and look, we can go any number of ways, but the things that we're telling our clients right now is the most important thing is this tariff decision by the Supreme Court. Now, February 20th, unless the Supreme Court does something kind of weird that we don't think that they're going to, February 20th is the date that most earliest date that the Supreme Court could come back and give us a ruling on President Trump's IEEPA tariffs. Now, this is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. Think back to Liberation Day when President Trump stood in the Rose Garden and he held up his placard saying, "Here's all the new tariff rates, etc." Well, there's been legal challenges that have been challenging the legality of that decision. And this is sort of interesting because it's really going to dictate President Trump's tariff policy for the rest of 2026, if not 2027 and 2028. So there's a fast way of doing tariffs and a slow way of doing tariffs. So the fast way is IEEPA. So if you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and you see a Truth Social post from the president saying, look, this country is going to have a 25% tariff rate unless they do something else, he's using IEEPA as his authority to do that. That's been challenged in the courts. The two appeals courts that have heard the case have said that, President Trump does not have the legality to do that. And our litigation analysts are looking at this as well, and they think there's a 60% chance that the Supreme Court is going to come back and say, President Trump, you can't use IEEPA. Now, that's going to lead to what our friends over at Bloomberg News has called refund chaos, because Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said there's somewhere around 120 to 150 million dollars. Billion dollars that have to be refunded in that case. Now, just after the new year, Customs and Border, they put out a final rule that actually reiterated that you could do this via electronic funds transfer, so you don't have to go back to the era of paper checks. But President Trump has also said, well, I'm not going to give up tariffs here. I'm going to just move to the slow way of doing tariffs. And those are things like investigations. So if you read in the news like sections 232 or section 301, just note that it's an investigation. It's a slower way to get to the similar result, but it's not this immediate headline tariff reaction that we've been seeing in the news.
Yeah, and what happens is the Supreme Court comes back and says, "Screw you! We're not going to do this. We're gonna take off the tariffs, and you got to pay them back." What happens?
So, obviously, you're not going to see like Amazon going forth and saying, look, give me a check for $500 million. There's something called the harmonization trade schedule. And I recommend any of your listeners to not go and see it because it is such a pain. I'm hoping that we can use ChatGPT to actually make this a little bit easier. But, tariffs come in and they come in at the line item. And it's not like, you're paying a tariff Amazon's not going to get a check for $500 million. They have to go to all probably 150,000 line items and say, look, we need a tariff for this or this or that. So it's going to take time. The process hasn't really been established. But from the policy point of view, President Trump is going to immediately launch these investigations. Now, the limitations are with these investigations is rather than it being placed on a country, think being placed on an industry. So rather than China, think semiconductors. From the good news from the policy, from the market perspective, is that we know that investigations are happening. We just don't know really the process if it plays out. It's either by the Commerce Department or the U.S. Trade Representative. The key question, though, that I'm telling my clients is this, is that if we see President Trump immediately say we're going to launch investigations, say February 21st or February 24th or whatever, those investigations on the quick side usually take 2 to 3 months. Is President Trump going to then reintroduce tariffs 3 months before the midterms when tariffs are not popular with the American populace? I don't have the answer to that question, but it's something that we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, and you mentioned the harmonization tariff schedule. I put it up there. Just click on that button actually for it. Let's get to it. There's a lot of talk right now about taxes. And a lot of people are very concerned going into this that the president have said, hey, we're going to give you back on the tariff schedule $2,000 check. I'm going to give you a $5,000 check. And I haven't seen any of those checks, Nathan. Are they coming? What's going on here, man?
They are not coming unless the president can find a fund to reallocate it, appropriated money. And look, what President Trump's referring to here is another what's called reconciliation bill. So, as you remember, the way it works in the States is the House of Representatives passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, it has to be the identical bill. They come together like Voltron, it goes to the White House's desk. The Senate has this thing called the filibuster. And I say this to all of our non-American clients who are watching right now. The filibuster is 250 years of best practice that allows one senator to come up and say, I block legislation from getting a vote unless 60 senators overturn him and her. It's not written down in our Constitution. It's not written down anywhere. It's essentially best practice. Now, there is one way you can get around the filibuster, and that is using the process called reconciliation. It can only happen one time per fiscal year, and it largely has to be budget neutral. Now, this is how President Biden got the Inflation Reduction Act. This is how President Obama got Obamacare through. This is how President Trump got his first Trump tax cuts through. And this is how the One Big Beautiful bill passed last year. Now, we are in that window that Congress can have another bite at the apple because it has to be once per fiscal year. The US government fiscal year ends on September 30th. And so President Trump has been saying, look, we should actually do this. And the reconciliation platform would be the vehicle to go forth and do this $2,000 stimulus check. The problem is that the votes just aren't there. The margin in the House of Representatives at the moment is like down to one. It's one of those things where you're not going to get all those individuals to come and agree and say, look, we need to do this, especially when there's a bulk of the Republican Party that recognizes that this could be inflationary. So unless President Trump has a way that he can reallocate funds, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You talk about the midterms. Right now, Republicans haven't won a single election in between now and the past presidential election. Is it looking good or bad for the Republicans here?
So, historically, it's always been, a swing to the other party. I mean, think of American politics. A lot of people use the guardrail example. I took my son bowling the other day with the bumper lanes, so I'm going to use the bumper lane example. My son can't throw the ball straight down the lane. It just goes left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, and that's how American politics is as well. We had an election, President Trump won, and then generally the midterm after that election swings to the other party. So think of President Trump and the Tea Party, President Biden, and
Yeah.
the MAGA movement, and so the historical trend is going towards the Democrats. Now let's include Polymarket and Kalshi here and some of the betting markets, because the Kalshi and the betting markets, the prediction markets have it around 75 to 80% chance that Democrats take the House. You're looking at probably around 20 to 30 seat swing. And when you have a margin of one, the Democrats potentially would take the House. But there is a lot of news articles out there about the Senate, because right now, should be a good race for the Republicans. There are a lot of Republicans who are running for re-election in states that President Trump won. But the thing that I would say is that when it comes to the Senate races in particular, you got to look at just not only the chances of people winning, but the amount of money that parties have to spend in that state. And I'm looking specifically at Texas, because if you get a race where the Democrats are somewhat competitive, even if they don't have a chance of winning, it's going to force Republicans to spend money in that state when they should be spending money somewhere else. And so maybe money that's going to Texas should have been going to Maine to help Susan Collins win for re-election. So where I'm going with this is that the scenario, according to the betting markets, and this is what I think investors should be just taking into account, is that you got a Democratic House in 2027, potentially Republicans keep the Senate. In that scenario, you get gridlock. And for the last 2 years of President Trump's term, you're not going to see much of the way of legislation coming out. I don't think you would either. And what happens for presidents in their last 2 years of their term when they become a lame duck? This happened to President Obama, and this happened to President George W. Bush. As you know, they get really focused on geopolitical matters and they start traveling around the world, because the power of the presidency is more powerful when it comes to things like trade, tariffs, national security, and foreign relations.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, will this hurt the domestic agenda when it gets into this lame duck position here?
It's a great question. And so, what I tell my clients all the time is there are three ways of implementing anything that comes out of President Trump's mouth. And just about 3 months ago, I added a fourth way based off of what's happening. And this is how you should be thinking about the rest of President Trump's term. Is it legislation, regulation, or executive orders? Now, legislation, gridlock, it's not going to happen. Sometimes it does. I mean, there are bills out there that can get bipartisan support. I think a crypto bill can pass this year, for example. But oftentimes legislation is difficult to come by. Deregulation, yes, deregulation can happen, but it's slow. It takes time. There's no magic wand that says, poof, you can go forth and deregulate. And then executive orders, well, you're either doing something. I like to say the executive orders are a fancy way of the president picking up the phone and telling his staff to do something that he already has the authority to do. But executive orders are also being put into the courts as President Trump tests the legality or the power of the executive branch versus the legislative branch. But this is the fourth way, and this is where we should be thinking about this in the last 2 years, is the bully pulpit. And a perfect example is President Trump putting a statement out on Truth Social and then pushing industry and sectors to respond to that. Perfect example is this credit card interest cap at 10%. President Trump puts a statement on Truth Social that says, look, effective January 20th, credit card interest rates will be capped at 10% for 1 year. Now, I just checked my credit card interest this morning in advance of this call. It's not capped at 10%. There's no way that President Trump has the authority to do that. And there is legislation out there from Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Josh Hawley to do it. That's not going to go anywhere. So what does President Trump do? Uses the bully pulpit. And according to our friends over at Bloomberg News, Bank of America and Citigroup are exploring this idea of a credit card that's capped at 10% for 1 year. So, industry does have to respond. I think that's what you're going to see for the last 2 years of the Trump term.
Yeah, and one of the things that he did over his campaign and I think won on it pretty much was cryptocurrency. There's so many rules and regulations that are going through the House and the Senate. Obviously, you've got this Genius Act and then the Clarity Act. Well, by the time he leaves office, what do you think is going to actually be accepted and actually law?
So I think there's three things to keep in mind. One is, and I'll just knock it out of the first part, is this idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The idea of the United States going out there and purchasing Bitcoin. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent just last week said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, that he does not have authority over using taxpayer dollars to do that. Now, I think he actually does have the authority if you use something like the Exchange Stabilization Fund to go out there and purchase Bitcoin, but I don't see it happening. I'm at a 30% chance of that policy changing in 2026. The second is, what are we going to see from Congress? So the Clarity Act passed last year from the House. We're still waiting for the Senate to get their bill together. It's going to look very close, but this idea of a bill gives the CFTC authority over spot markets, declares what is a security versus what is a commodity. There's still some issues over stablecoin yields. Coinbase in particular voiced their opposition to it. But long story short is I think they can get this resolved, and I'm at a 60% chance that it can pass this year. The reason being is that if they don't get it this year and the Democrats take the House, it's going to be much more difficult to get a bill. And then real quickly on the third side, you are going to see the SEC and the CFTC to take steps on rulemakings to make regulatory clarity for crypto a thing. The problem is that if a CFTC or an SEC does it right now and it's not dictated by Congress, a future SEC or CFTC can come back and change it and eliminate it and make the game much more difficult to play in. So that's why I think this congressional piece is so important, but I do think it's going to pass this year.
And let's talk about that from a perspective. I know you do domestic policy, but trade is a very domestic policy issue too. Are you able to talk to us a little bit about the USMCA, the changes that are going on?
Yeah, obviously it has to be renegotiated this year. July 1st is the anniversary, and that's the date. In fact, Senate Commerce just announced they're going to have a hearing on it. I can't remember, apologies if it's either taking place right now and I'm not being the best political analyst here. Anyway, Senate Commerce has a hearing on it.
10 a.m., right?
Yeah. So, the thing about the USMCA to note is that the United States, Mexico, and Canada's economies are intertwined. Obviously, I think the saying is if the United States economy burps, they feel it in Canada. I know I'm screwing that up, but the negotiations are going to take place. They're not going to be pleasant in terms of headline risk. There are going to be lots of headlines. We just saw President Trump yesterday, claiming that the United States needs to have half ownership of the bridge that's going up between Michigan and Ontario. That Canada and Prime Minister Carney just came back with and said, look, we paid for the entire thing ourselves. There was union work on the American side that was building it, but Canada paid for it ourselves. But I would just say is that there's a big difference between what you see in the headline risk space and the headlines versus the actual nuts and bolts of the
Yeah.
operation. And so, it's very difficult to say here's how the playbook would work, but you see statements from the president that leads to headline risk, leads to a lot of people asking questions, and then things calm down and it just goes back to the normal process of the negotiations. So we'll see how this plays out. But, when President Trump says that tariffs are his most favorite word in the dictionary, he doesn't disagree by that. I mean, this is very much his playbook here. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. But it's certainly something to keep in mind as we get closer to Memorial Day.
And he also has got a new pick for the Fed chair, that Kevin Warsh. And do you think that will get passed in the Senate?
So, this is a great question because Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who's a Republican who's retiring, has said that he's going to block Kevin Warsh's nomination from going to the Senate Banking Committee unless this investigation into Jerome Powell over his testimony to Congress on the renovations that are over at the Federal Reserve. And look, I need those renovations done because they're blocking a lane on Constitution. That's how I drive back to Virginia. So the quicker they get done with those Fed renovations, the better. But Senator Tellis has said that he's going to block Kevin Warsh's nomination. Now, can he do it? Yes, he can. Senate Banking Committee is 13-11. If Senator Tillis holds firm, you get 12-12. There's no way to advance this nomination out of the hearing. Now, let's say that Senator John Thune, the majority leader, wants to bypass the committee. Well, you need 60 votes to discharge the petition, kick it out of the committee, and go straight to the floor. You're not going to get 60 votes. Well, then you would need 50 votes to change the Senate rules, and you're not going to get that either. So as long as this investigation into Jerome Powell continues, there's effectively no way that Kevin Warsh and Senator Tillis remains firm. We're in a standstill. The White House said, well, maybe we'll just wait until Senator Tillis is gone. Well, Senator Tillis is here until January 2027. So it wouldn't be surprising to see the DOJ come out and say, look, this investigation is not going anywhere, because Senator Tillis said just last week is that if this is where things are going and people are going to be investigated for what they say to Congress, every single time a person from Congress is going to ask a regulator a question, they're going to say, well, I will take it under advisement with my counsel and I'll reply back in writing, and I'm not going to say anything else. So I do think this is a valid, this is something that we're going to have to see play out. But long story short is that if Kevin Warsh were to come to a vote, he'd get the nod.
And not to get too political about this, but I think the biggest question everybody's been asking lately, and it's all over social media, I cannot get away with it, away from it, is Epstein files. Bill and Hillary are going to be right in front of Congress. Is it going to be open? Is it going to be anything revelation coming out of this? They all say they want the bombshells coming out. Do you believe that?
Fortunately, as a market participant, as somebody who just looks at the markets, we don't look at the Epstein files all that closely just because of, our focus is on other things. But from the Bloomberg News reporting that I was just reading this morning, I think the Clinton hearings are going to be behind the closed doors. But again, we'll see, because it's certainly a story that everybody here in Washington is talking about.
And I think the most important question, Nathan, I have to ask you: are you ready for the cherry blossoms festivals and all the fun things that are going to go happen in the springtime in DC? Are you ready for all that?
Absolutely. The only thing is, and I would just say is that if you are a tourist and you're coming here to Washington, you want to see the cherry blossoms, don't. I mean, it's just absolutely painful. But if you do come, there are like the National Arboretum, and there's a bunch of other arboretums smaller within Fairfax County and up in Maryland that have their own cherry blossoms. It's a much more enjoyable experience rather than the 2.5 hours it would take you to drive around the tidal basin. It's absolutely brutal. But I do recommend doing the 10K race and the marathon. Those things are fun.
Those days. All right, Nathan. And the last question I have for you, man: will you come back and come see us, man?
Absolutely. This has been a pleasure anytime, and if anybody's watching and I can ever be of service, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, and I've definitely put Nathan out there. Folks, click on that button, x.com. Nathan Dean, DC. He's definitely the broadest guy there for the team right there for In Politics. So please give him a follow and let's go talk to him. And we'll see you right here next week, my man.
Awesome. Thank you very much.